We try to keep our team thin in the beginning when we are exploring design decisions. A simple concept that most people can relate to is like the too many cooks in the kitchen kind of thing. When you need to make a decision, more people don't help in general, unless you're missing like expertise or subject matter expertise in general. But even then, like you want to like glean from it a bit. Like just imagine trying to make a decision with 2 people in a room, let alone 5, let alone 10, let alone 60 people waiting in the wings for you to like come out of this room to like, hey, tell us what to make. And you're like, yeah, dude, like I don't know yet.
Welcome to the Gaming Founders Podcast, a show where we interview the founders that have shaped the gaming industry. I'm Eden Chen, the CEO of Pragma, a back-end game engine founded by engineering leaders that built the platforms for some of the largest live service games, like League of Legends, Fortnite, Destiny 2, and Plants vs. Zombies 2. Pragma powers services like accounts, matchmaking, and player data for the world's most ambitious live service games.
And I'm Kevin Zane, partner at Upfront Ventures. We're a venture capital firm based in LA and San Francisco. I lead game investments both in studios as well as the pick and shovel tools that power game developers and content creators to do their best work, including Pragma. We interview founders on their origin stories, the tactics that help them survive and thrive, and key lessons for anyone interested in building the next generation of leading gaming companies. Learn more and subscribe today at pragma.gg/gamingfounders.
Today's episode is a very special one, our first with a live audience. It was recorded live during LA Tech Week and features Stephen Lim, also known as Slim, and Trevor Romleski. Slim was a product designer and VP of R&D at Riot and is known for always doing right by players. Also at Riot, Trevor was a game designer and worked on League of Legends. The duo co-founded Valorant and then 3 years ago started a new studio called Raidbase. We talked about how they got into games, Valorant, and navigating the R&D gauntlet, their stay small approach at Raidbase and hiring, and funding advice. Most notably, we went super deep into the product development process and how they find the fun and figure out who they are building for. Thanks for listening, and thanks again to Slim and Trevor for sharing their wisdom. Please don't forget to subscribe and review the Gaming Founders Podcast. And now, on to the episode.
Great. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming to the first live taping of the Gaming Founders Podcast. I'm Kevin, one of the co-hosts, partner here at Upfront Ventures. We're an early stage investor, been here since '96, and I lead the games investing practice because I play a lot of games. And really, this whole idea was actually my portfolio company, Eden Chen's idea. Why don't you share a little bit about yourself?
Hey, everybody. I'm Eden, one of the co-hosts, and started a company called Pragma. We power live services through a backend that does accounts, matchmaking, all the stuff that no one hopefully knows about unless something goes horribly wrong.
All the work
super
that we
sexy stuff
live and
in
die
games.
on, though.
But yeah, just a huge fan of games my whole life, and had spent a lot of time working with a lot of new founders that are kind of starting new companies, spinning out of Riot and whatnot, and thought, why don't we create like a resource for people to actually be able to hear from more people, and it's not just me having one-on-one conversations with people. So yeah, that's me. So real quick, Slim and Trevor, I'll do a very, very brief intro and then let them go into more detail. Slim and Trevor were kind of co-founding team of Valorant, and then, is it about 3 years ago now? Yeah, about 3 years ago, started this awesome new studio called Raidbase, and I'm excited to talk a lot more about what they're working on. But yeah, I guess why don't we just get going on intros then, and maybe just talking about how you guys got into games and what your sort of origin story is.
How do we get into games? Well, how far do you want to go back? So similarly, we play a lot of games growing up. I'm an 80s kid, grew up in an era of Nintendo, but I actually was denied one. Growing up in an immigrant Asian household, probably for the best. But that since I'm a pretty crafty kid, I convinced my parents to get me a PC, since that was an educational tool. And from then, I've been PC-centric. I was going to say the other way to say it for a second, but PC-centric for a long time, which then led to like early BBSing, which meant a lot of very early like multiplayer games. Some MUDs, then onto the Blizzard train of games throughout, and that never ended. A lot of Counter-Strike. A lot of MMOs, a lot of RTSs. Those are probably my top 3 things. Then this past decade has been a lot of sandbox PvP games. Top 2 favorite games of the last 10 years are probably Rust and Tarkov. Tarkov, especially in the last few years, which has particularly ruined me for every other game. Now I don't feel anything in any other game, sadly. So, but yeah, it's. That's where I'm kind of focused as a gamer. And inevitably, all these things have influenced me personally and whatever I can reach. And inevitably, our new game has pulled in a lot of those elements.
I have like the same Asian origin story. Couldn't get any consoles growing up, and then had to get a PC console. Got really used to Control Escape and Alt Tab when the parents are coming up the stairs. It would take like 3 minutes for like the thing to like minimize.
It always freezes up, right?
Yeah, it's like when you hear the first footstep, you're like, no. Like, Trevor, what's your
Trevor,
story?
you have a totally different story, right? Like you had all the
little
game
bit.
We got
consoles,
everything.
like-
Every Christmas, we got a Nintendo game.
Yeah, totally. New console every year.
That's actually kind of true.
It's not a stereotype for a reason. Yeah.
I started on Nintendo. Me and my 2 brothers, we played Mario Party, Super Smash Bros. All these family feuds. Tons of fights started over who stole stars from each other in Mario Party. But when I was in elementary school, near the end of the school year, there was a kid. There was the son of one of the teachers, and they were playing StarCraft. I didn't know what it was. It looked super cool. So I asked him, "Oh, what game is that?" He's like, "Oh, StarCraft." We didn't. My dad had a computer and he played Diablo 1 on it, but I couldn't watch it. My parents were like, "Oh, you can't."
Cool dad.
Yeah. So I managed to convince them to buy StarCraft, and that was kind of my first introduction to like a competitive PC game, and that's really where I spent a lot of my time. So StarCraft, Warcraft, Counter-Strike, Team Fortress. I just loved competitive games that turned into Dota. WoW rating, eventually League of Legends, things like that. And that kind of got me into the game industry because I was, we'll just say, an aspiring pro for League of Legends. Way back in the day, we were competing as one of the top 3 teams, and we were trying to qualify for World Cyber Games, which back then was like, a pretty big tournament. Rest in peace at this point.
Yeah.
And there was like Newegg online, Alienware Arena, and at the time, I was really active on the League of Legends forums, and I would kind of talk about balance and changes I would recommend, and got the attention of Tom Cadwell, who was heading up design there, and he's like, "Oh, why don't you apply for an internship?" And I had just never thought about a career in games or the idea of that being something I could make a living on. I don't know. I just played them and took them very seriously. I wanted to be like an esports pro, but I was like, well, do I go down this esports route or do I go down this path of video games, making them? And I ended up doing an internship. Told my team at the time, like, "Hey guys, I'm gonna have to quit the team." We were qualifying at the time, so they found a ringer. And they all ended up doing really well. Like Odd One from TSM, Xpecial were on our team at the time.
Wow.
But yeah, so I started as an intern and did live balance. When I joined Riot, the first thing they said to me is I sat down at the computer and they're like, "Just do anything you want." Like literally that was what they told me, and I was like, "Well, I'll just start doing balance for the game," stuff that I've been wanting to do forever. So
There's no onboarding, no
yeah,
nothing.
I had to learn.
You'd be lucky if you have a computer, actually.
I was one of the fortunate ones that had a computer, and I had to learn how to script, like Lua script, and I had never done any of that before. And just went from there and had to learn and navigate and figure out how to be valuable for the team. Many years later, met Slim and we started Valorant, and then now we're at Raid Base, and I'm act as the game director for Raid Base.
Awesome.
Just quick follow up on that was, I'm curious how Tom Cadwell, was he just on the forums looking for?
Yeah.
Yeah. So one
He
thing,
did all these
That was
awesome
his
things back
recruiting
then. It
thing?
was
yeah,
awesome,
one thing that was really cool about Riot, especially back then, was they were so active on the forums. So you
Okay.
would go on a forum and you'd see Cadwell and you'd see Feet Ginsu on the forums and all these people. And it made you feel like they're committed to making this game awesome. Like they're down in the trenches, they're listening to players, they're going to make the game great. And I was playing Han at the time too. And I was like, okay, which MOBA is going to end up being more popular? And just because of the engagement from the team at Riot, that gave me the confidence to play League instead. And because Tom was active on the forums, he like saw all my posts, and we actually started playing games together, and just built a relationship that way.
What did the promotion, like, you were started as an intern? What did that look like as you started to move up the ranks?
Yeah, so I when I started, I was like totally messing around in school. Like I was spending all my time trying to compete, be a pro in League. It was like a ridiculous thing. And 3 months into my internship, they're like, oh, why don't you apply for a full-time role? And I was like, oh, well, should I finish school? And I talked to Brandon Beck at the time, because they interviewed everybody that joined the company. And he's like, well, if you're going to stay in games and be a game developer, you're probably going to learn way more here than anything in school. But if you're not going to stay in games, like, you should go finish school. And I loved it so much, the 3 months I was there at the time. So I applied, and fortunately they started me as an associate game designer, and then went from there on League.
Wow. Another thing my Asian parents would have definitely freaked out at if I dropped out of school in the last.
Yeah.
So Slim, I think your story is a little bit different. You were already at your dream job at Blizzard. I think you were working on some predecessor version of Overwatch. How did
Project Titan?
What did Brandon? What did the co-founders do to convince you to jump ship?
It was a lot. When looking back, man, there's been so many minor miracles that it's hard to even recognize what they were at the time. It was kind of like, I would say the guiding force was finding my tribe, basically. So landing at Blizzard, I tried very hard to get into Blizzard. I mean, just growing up with Blizzard games, like so many people, I applied, I think, 5 times across 6 years.
Wow.
For very different roles, and every time was like, you're our favorite external candidate. When was the external candidate? I'll try again next year. It was like all that. And the first time I got declined, I was like, well, Blizzard isn't happening, so should I even be in the game industry, and should I just go back to Silicon Valley? And it was literally applying back to Silicon Valley after the first time I got rejected from Blizzard. I was just like full tilt, and I don't think I get tilted very easily. I was just like, well, if you can't work at Blizzard, then what's the point of all this? So thankfully I stuck with it. Wow. And then it was very close that I almost went back to Silicon Valley, but I'm really glad I didn't. But when I started at Blizzard finally, at that point I had played Counter-Strike, 7,000. It was like the main thing I did during college, basically. And then I also raided in WoW for 7 years, and so getting the chance to work on a shooter MMO, how often do you get that chance? And then at Blizzard, I was just like, oh, I'm freaking done. I'm gonna work on this shit for the next 30 years, I'll sacrifice whatever to do this. And so I went in with that mentality. So I was completely committed, completely focused on that. And this was also peak Blizzard too, so it was post, WoW climb, and WoW was still climbing at that time. And so I wasn't thinking anything, but I was this is a sequence. So League came out end of 2009. I started at Blizzard January, a couple months after that. And then a couple months after that was GDC 2010. And I had a friend, we had an invite to the Riot party there. And it was really, it was really ghetto. It was in a dingy warehouse, drink tickets. It was just, so I remember standing on this balcony, looking at the general party, kind of like an introvert, so I was just observing on the side. And one thing instantly stood out, which was League was being played on a couple tables on the floor, and someone was shoutcasting it. And I'm pretty sure that was the first time in 5 or 6 years I went to a GDC party that had a game at the party, which seems quite odd for that to be true, but I'm pretty sure that was true at that time. So, I already had like a great impression just because of that. Like I didn't need any like fancy like party or fancy drinks or anything like that. So I was just already kind of like in an instant like, oh, what is this? Instantly good mood. And so talked with a bunch of people within Riot and finally met Brandon along in that. And we basically became gaming buddies after that. And just not thinking, oh, it's like meeting a gaming founder who actually plays games. Like, sadly, that's more rare than it should be. And just because of that, we wanted to just play games. And I was like, oh, it's interesting that I finally met a game leader that plays games. Like, it's sad that that's rare, but that was what kind of motivated me to keep in touch with him without having anything in mind for like working at Riot or anything like that. So just like, who is this human being who is like this? And when he talked, I don't know how many of you guys know Brandon, if you're lucky to know him, like there's like a vortex of like, he can make you feel like anything is possible with regard to making a difference in players' lives specifically. So it's not like, oh, anything is possible. It's not that generic like thing. It was specifically like, if you're a gamer, we can do something about helping other gamers. So let's go and do it and not waste this opportunity. And that specific thing really resonated with half this room here and like who were from Riot. And it was a very precious thing. And after a couple of years, I got a kick in the butt from my wife, and we decided to apply to Riot. And then we were off to the races. And I happened to sit close to Trevor early on in that. And yeah, that's one thing led to another. Start playing games. Really similar story to how I spent time with Brandon. Like we started doing that with everyone else we met, and got to know a lot of great people.
I was always wondering, while you guys were playing games, did he ever ask like, you should come and work at Riot?
No.
You just played.
Wow. Okay.
I mean, the reality is like he's basically trying to build a relationship,
right?
Because Riot's off the radar. So even though League was doing well at the time, I remember until the Forbes article started showing up, like literally 4 or 5 years later after Riot, like when we were recruiting between 2011 and 2014, the number one response I would get back from other professional devs at other storied developers was like, oh, is that League of Legends the game that the kids play at lunch? And like they were just so out of it, and we're like, yeah. And they, even if they were aware of League, they weren't aware that Riot Games makes League. And so nobody wanted to work at Riot at that time, other than people within like Brandon and Mark's like vortex. And so so we tried to, I guess, mimic or replicate that and just try to espouse the values kind of throughout the industry. And once it was kind of self-filtering. I think the people where that message resonates like started to like poke into Riot.
I just kind of think about early team building, and obviously you guys are running a new studio now. Like, are there any kind of like principles or things that you learned from Mark and Brandon on how to build team? Obviously, there's so many amazing people that have been hired that have gone on to now start other studios and whatnot. But what are some of the things that you guys have kind of had a small team for longer than most, I would say. So how did you guys? Do you guys have principles that you decided on before you hired your first 10 people?
Yeah, we're not so far away from Riot. I think many ex-Riot studios, and there are many, unsurprisingly want to make games that are social, want to do right by players. We're not too distant from that. I think without necessarily trying to be different, we picked a couple things we wanted to stand for, and we try to make it known through conversations like this. We've chosen our words on our website very, very carefully and surgically. We, I think, are pretty particular, maybe some see us as extreme in our service to a particular, like, people use different words. I will say like a connoisseur audience, like people who are like discerning, smart, judgmental, hard to win over, but also very engaged in the games that they play. Some people, that's not the audience for them because they're seen as like narrow or hard to win over. They are those things, but we are also those people, and so we try to find that tribe with them, and we try to put it out there on our website and try to attract people who want to sign up for that or are that as well. and it's just kind of, again, self-filtering. Best way I could put it is like stand for something and then be more specific about it. Like the vast majority of websites out there is like, we're from the makers of blah, 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 and everyone's website looks the same. And we're going to do Riot players, and we train people to say like Blizzard trained people to say we're gameplay first. Riot trained players, players first. And people repeat that ad nauseum, and it's lost its meaning, I think. So, but I think with us, we are pretty specific and dedicated to that.
So then maybe jumping on, Riot has had a lot of R&D games famously canceled, including even after many years of work. How were you guys able to get Valorant through the gauntlet? Like, what was that ideation like, getting it through, many years of building it?
I mean, obviously, many years of just persevering through a lot of difficult times. I mean, there's a lot of stories of moments where the game could have ended, off of a single decision. There was a lot.
We're not being dramatic there. Really, like people were about to quit that day, in that moment, exit the room like 10 times. I'm not exaggerating at all. More than 10 times.
Yeah, and I think at the time it was kind of a ambiguous scenario for what it means to like get a game through the process at Riot, and like when do you know a game's ready? There was no like gates or anything to define what you need to do. We had to find that and kind of show the company that what we were doing was special, or there was some promise in that, and all of that was on us to figure that out and define what that looks like. And the fundamental thing that I think always rings true for us is focusing on the product and finding something fun and building something that we think the audience were interested in would find special and really appreciate. And we spent many years just getting even to that point. And then we had to figure out, how do we buy in the rest of the company? How do we show that we think we have something that players might be interested in? But that was not defined for us. We had to figure that out. We had to figure out what playtest formats make sense. What kind of audience can we bring in that represents the players that we think would be excited about this kind of game? And then we also had to establish some fundamentals around who the game's for, what the game is ultimately about, and what are the the pillars of it, because all this feedback is coming in, all these concerns, all these considerations, and to be able to use a razor to understand what makes sense and what doesn't, even when it might feel wrong, or you're up against all odds of everybody else criticizing it. That was imperative for us to continue to pierce through and ultimately make something. But it was very difficult, of course, along the way, the entire time, and we learned so much during those phases. Everything from the product to team building to managing the external stakeholders, and I think we're still pretty amazed. Ultimately, it came through and became something. Yeah.
So for that first maybe major decision to even get to a tactical shooter, like how long did that take? What led to that?
Yeah, go again.
Okay. So when we started, we didn't exactly know. At first, we actually didn't even know we were going to make a competitive shooter. We thought, we have competitive backgrounds. We feel like we understand that audience better than maybe any other space for ourselves.
By the time we started, League was establishing as a competitive esport.
Yeah.
And it was kind of like standing by itself. Not that it was the first, but that at that time, Counter-Strike was, in just grassroots small events, and StarCraft was like not really a thing anymore except in Korea. Like, so it was kind of like just alone for a while. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so we thought there was an opportunity, especially at Riot, to build another competitive game. And through talking about it and where the opportunities are, we thought a shooter could be a nice complement to the portfolio of Riot, especially on the competitive side. And at the time when we started, competitive shooters were non-existent on PC. Like, a lot of people had written off shooters on PC entirely and thought, they're only going to be on console.
Call of Duty.
It's too
crazy
hard
to say that sentence out loud.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that console was dominant at that time.
Right.
It was like,
and, no one could figure out anti-cheat, things like that, and console did it a little bit better at the time. So we went through that process. So.
Well, I'm curious if you guys have sort of a product development process in terms of how you, both obviously at Riot, but also at Raid-Base, how did you guys come up with who your persona was? What kind of, how did you just, like, how big is the market? Do you guys have those questions? Like, what? what kind of process would other people use? It's like someone starting a new studio today. How do you figure out what do I build?
So connecting with your last question about like the process of getting kind of momentum and approval and gates and stuff. What we went through was ambiguous because it was not defined at Riot. The broader context at Riot was that 99% of the company is oriented around League. There is no machine set up for other games. So there weren't, and Riot's not trying to be a publisher, there weren't like defined gates or anything like that. But what we had to show was very similar to what all of us are beholden to show to investors or any type, or really ultimately to our own teams and also to our own players, is that what we decide and what we design and what we build is actually relevant and resonant with the audience. So if you follow that train back to the root, we try very hard to define who our player is, which I think is not anything mind-blowing. Like you want to picture who your audience is, who you're building for. We are just very relatively extreme about it, and we try to be, again, specific about who our audience is. We think it's a mistake, not that there's a right way of making games or making a product, but we think it's pretty rough to start building, because it's exciting to build. You see like all this progress and you're like, oh, we have a thing. And certainly some huge products start by that kind of exploration for sure. But there's hundreds of decisions to make around a product. And I think if you don't have someone you're picturing to help you make those decisions that are very subjective, with nobody to tell you if you're right or wrong in any one decision, at the end of the day, they're going to take this thing, they're going to engage with it or not, and then when you ask why, most people don't practice the articulation of why they don't like a thing. So they'll just say it sucks, or they say it's awesome, and then they walk away. Like any of those things happen. So it's our jobs to preemptively make some of those decisions. We think picturing a specific person, and more importantly, not a specific person, a type of profile of a person, and articulating their wants and needs. So for us, a thesis being who is it for, why do they care, is critical for navigating that. And we think too many people starting off their adventure skip this part or assume something and just stick with it relatively arbitrarily without continuing to revisit it. We're just basically obsessive about revisiting it and make sure it's still valid. And even till today, we're 2.5, 3 years in, and we're still like paranoid, like it's still a thing, it's still a thing all the time. So we're relatively extreme about that. But it's really to help us navigate that myriad of decisions, 10 a day, 100 a month, like 1,000 a year kind of thing, and it's just craziness.
Yeah, that was refining over what we learned on Valorant. Like when we started, we had some ideas of opportunities, experiences we had growing up on some of these games, and where we could potentially like build a product that people would be excited about. But also, like the market changed a lot while we were developing the game. Like when we started, CS:GO had come out and was pretty much dead. Like I said, there was no other shooters on the PC market, and all of a sudden, like CS gets better, Rainbow Six Siege comes online, Overwatch came out. So all these things had us, second guess or challenge why we're making the thing we're making. And I think we got more intentional over time, ultimately to the point where we could really understand why this game specifically makes sense that we're building relative to all the other things we could be doing or other games out there in the market. And so for Raid-Based, the first thing we did was like, why should we make this game? That was the first question we wanted to be able to answer. And then who's it for? And like Slim said, the motivations is the way we see it. So we don't really look at it like based on genre or like age,
platform,
group,
all the traditional demographics. Those are useful, but not what we go by.
Yeah, and one example as a learning for us is a lot of people are surprised that there was overlap between League of Legends players and Valorant players. Because it's a completely different genre, different camera angle, everything. And for us, it wasn't surprising because if you look at the core motivation of competition, it satisfies that motivation in very different ways. So it's actually pretty interesting to play something that satisfies that motivation in a completely different perspective, different skill set, different set of knowledge and mechanics. So we really think that way. And we think players will come to whatever genre, whatever camera angle, if it satisfies their motivations. And that is the razor for how we make all our decisions. So even when we finally get to features as the last part, it's like, does this feature make sense for one of these motivations? And how does it help deliver on the thesis that we've defined?
And I guess, who's it for? Is there any consideration? I guess, what are the exercises that you're doing there outside of like, I'm this type of player? How are you broadening that out to make sure that it applies to enough people? Like, what's that process even look like? Are you just talking to a lot of people, or like, what's that process look like?
The player motivations are relatively classic and stable from what we've seen. Okay. And there's like 8 or 9 different kinds of profiles. Out of those, we chose a subset of 3 of them for Valorant, and 5 of them for our current game, because it's a broader thing just by being a sandbox. And Trevor can walk you through some of these examples. But we found that they're relatively classic. Like looking at, starting with anecdotal, like friends, like we're picturing so-and-so, picturing so-and-so. One thing that was interesting in this exercise of developing the definition of these profiles is we're actually combinations of different motivations. Why you do, there's multiple reasons why you do certain things or engage with certain things. And when we were going through specific people, we're like, dude, we could do this forever. We could define 300 people and like, we'll never hit the end of this. But then we realized along the way that each person is actually a combination, a blend of different motivations. So when we traced the root a bit, there was only like 8 or 9 or 10 of these.
Okay.
Yeah.
And yeah, to Slim's point, it's like a spectrum. And you'll see that when you play games. Like one night you might feel really competitive, and then the next night you're playing with someone that's better than you and you just want to be social and play with them.
Yeah.
And that might change you from like playing, ADC on bot lane in League to playing support or something like that. And I think that's the recognition that everyone isn't just set on one motivation and that's all they ever do in any game. But we want to be able to build a game where, at least within that spectrum of motivations, that experience is satisfying those activities, whatever they blend or weighting they choose to do within the experience.
Yep. Moving on to another topic, you guys, I think in both cases at Raid Base and I think even at Valorant, your teams were pretty constrained from a number standpoint. Maybe that's not true for Valorant, but I know for Raid Base that it was. Do you have any advice on how you think about team size? Are you looking for an inflection point before you expanding?
This is one of many topics that I don't have a specific right answer, but we can tell you why we do what we do. We try to keep our team thin in the beginning. When we are exploring design decisions, a simple concept that most people can relate to is like the too many cooks in the kitchen kind of thing. When you need to make a decision, more people don't help in general, unless you're missing like expertise or subject matter expertise in general. But even then, like you want to glean from it a bit. Like just imagine trying to make a decision with 2 people in a room, let alone 5, let alone 10, let alone 60 people waiting in the wings for you to like come out of this room to like, hey, tell us what to make. And you're like, dude, like I don't know yet, So we've just tanked that so much that we've learned at much pain. And I've done this like 3 or 4 times in a row. This will be the smallest team I make. And then and it's just too big already, too fast. And so with full control at Raid Base, as much as we can, maximize control at Raid Base, I would say we grew in proportion to our design confidence. And for our space, the sandbox space is probably one of the most complex spaces because of and pretty much any feature can be in a sandbox game. So normally you're choosing between like if they had our competitor game X has feature set Y has like matchmaking, so we should have matchmaking, and it's already hard enough to navigate like 3 to 5 to 10 moving parts. Our game has like 80 moving parts. It's literally over 80, and so instantly we're just like. I remember the first week when we were talking about this, we're like, dude, like both of us, neither of us can fit the game in our head. And if we can't, good luck to the rest of our future team of like, so how do I know? Try to pick between red, green, or blue, sweet, salty, or sour. It's like and no one will, it's just really cascading lack of confidence actually. So before, we had to exercise discipline to only grow if absolutely necessary when we were sure that the foundation was starting to get more and more solid to support so many things. even if we want to, everyone says like we want to empower our teams. It's like a popular thing to say right now. But left to your own devices, if you don't have context, if you don't understand what is a high quality decision or low quality decision in this context, in this game, in this team, then those people will just start to try their best. And then when you're there and you put yourself in a position as a leader to say, no, that's not right. No, that's not it. How many times are you going to say no to someone before they just like, okay, fine, just tell me what to do then? And that happens time after time again. And so, when you have to look at those people time and time again, just disappointed in the game, disappointed in you, it's just like, we should be better able to articulate why we made certain decisions. Not to say this is the right way, but enough so that they can get in the ballpark, or enough that we can define constraints. When I say constraints, it's not like a type, it's all a matter of treatment. You can define a direction as like a pinpoint or a field. We tend to go towards a field because the people we tend to like to hire are more aligned, and we lean on them more to make decisions. Yeah. So we give them more playground to run in, but we have to define something so that your cool idea, my cool idea, let's say we're just talking about your cool idea, we love your idea. We love like Harry's Berry Strawberries. We could talk about that and eat that all day. And then in a different conversation, we love like a certain chocolate from a certain chocolatier from this region in France or whatever. Like we love that, and then we like put those two things together, and sometimes it's magic. It's like, oh, it's chocolate covered strawberries. It's awesome. Yeah. But if Trevor really likes like tomatoes from the west slope of like Mount Vesuvius and whatever, they're grown at a certain farm in Italy, like that's great. But if you try to put tomatoes and strawberries together, you're kind of like it's very different. And so I'd like to think game features are kind of like that. So if you don't define why is chocolate not good for this situation or this meal or this experience, then you're setting yourself up for these like arguments and these circular conversations, and those things tend to devolve into basically like an argument that is unresolvable. And then the warning signs are somebody has to pull rank, somebody has to yell louder, or it's an attrition game where everyone gives up until one person wins out. And if you think about all of those scenarios, it's super arbitrary what you landed on. So how are we all like surprised Pikachu face that like by the time you get to this build, it didn't land, it didn't work, and you're like, oh, what happened? We like made this high quality art and we implemented my system, and everyone did the best they could in their little domain, but it didn't add up to something. And we think that happens way too much in the industry, and it just leads to all this kind of frustration and wasted effort and all that. So pulling all that back is why, like, yes, it's hard to recruit. Yes, recruiting shows progress in a way until it doesn't, where you have this thing, and it doesn't add up to something, you don't know what to do with it, and meanwhile there's 50 people yelling at you like, what do we do next? You're watching your burn rate go down. It's just like, your burn rate go up, sorry, and then your bank account go down, and like all that is, now try to make the decision with all that. Yeah. So then it's just super tilty and super arbitrary. Yeah.
Going back earlier, you were saying there were many steps along the way at Valorant where things could have gone horribly and the whole thing could have shut down. Like maybe at those time points, how did you guys ultimately make those decisions? And then I'd be curious, how did you maybe change your decision-making process now at Raybase? Any specific examples would be great to hear too.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the first ones I can remember early in the process was we started working on our concept, and we had a merry little band of like 4 or 5 people in a corner of Riot, 2013, end of 2013 or so. Then Brandon Beck and some of you may know like Thomas Vu came up with their own pitch for a sandbox game actually over Christmas break. So they came back, so we're just a few months in, building momentum for a competitive shooter, and they came back like really excited to like pitch us and test their pitch against us, because they knew we played like Rust at that time and everything. So we're like, oh. And so that conversation pretty quickly went towards like, should we just merge teams? Like, if you guys are already interested in this, and then we met in the game director, Joe Ziegler, his living room, and he happened to live in the house right next to Sujito and Sawtell. So in that living room, in that little yellow house, was the first time Valorant almost died. So we were in that living room, and there was the 5 of us, and we kept calling that other project the train, because it's Brandon's baby. Like, who'd be dumb enough to not hop on that train, right?
Okay, yeah.
We kept calling it the train, or like, oh, the train's coming, the train's like gonna run us over, and and all that. We're like, because circumstantially, like, and we were excited about the project too. So we're like, do we want to do that instead? And the room was like pretty quickly already slammed on that side. Like, oh, we should just like go join them and merge, and who knows what would have happened from there. But in that moment, I just like wanted to double check. I was like, hey guys, like, do we think what we're onto has any validity? Are we still excited about our thing? And the like immediate reaction was pretty strong. I was like, yeah, of course. Then I'm kind of like, what the fuck are we doing then? Like, why are we so willing to give up like this easily on this? And then incidentally, that kind of swung the room back. I wasn't trying to swing the room. I was just like asking a question because I'm like, I'll go either way on this. I do love both directions, and we have plenty of life to make either game. But
Clearly,
in that moment, it's
you got a sandbox game now.
yeah, right. Like we do. We want to make that game as well. But we did see that, and so I guess the short answer to your question, Kevin, is like, my tool set was much more limited back then, and I relied personally on conviction, but it wasn't baseless conviction, I think. It was based off of a lot of these principles that we're talking about around this thesis, like, those were like rougher back then, but conceptually similar to the practice that we have now. We're like better tool set, better practices of getting there now. That's a little bit more reliable, but in the same vein back then. Yeah.
So then maybe for raid bait, like how do the two of you guys divide up duties and actually whittle down, whatever, 100+ elements probably when you were starting to where you are currently, and then, making each of those increment, especially that first year. I'm just curious how you guys actually get to that sandbox, decision.
So the first thing we did, from what I remember, is we did that practice. Like, let's look at the competitor game set X and then their feature set Y. And we started assembling this, and it just added up to like 80 things. We're talking like crafting, so first of all, there's a lot of them. But one of those lines is like crafting. That's like 30, 50, 100 games.
Right.
One of them's like combat. So this list is wide and deep. So we're just all sitting there like just kind of paralyzed. And then like, I was stewing already on the semblance of like the thesis, but I didn't have the full words for it. I initially said some version of like people who want to matter in sandbox games. Like when I think back on like stories from Ultima Online and Eve and some of the big YouTube channels for Rust, people tell stories about like, I did this crazy thing and then everyone was chasing me, or everyone was out to get me, or I made this deal happen, or I made this partnership happen, brought these two warring clans together. Like, it was a lot of like reputation and association, but I was hovering in that concept for a while, but didn't have the statement, didn't have the words. And then kind of using that rough sense, I forget the first form of it, but we used that start of that thesis to kind of like slice and dice our way through these features lists. So now if you look at, can someone build a reputation based on combat? Well, yeah, there's like many kinds of games where that's more intuitively yes. Can someone build a reputation for clearing bosses? Like, well, okay, we can look at WoW World Firsts and like a number of games, like Monster Hunter and whatnot, speedrunners. Can someone build a reputation on crafting? And now we can look at maybe like real world economies. Like, I can go to Kevin for the highest quality metal on our server. I can go to Trevor for the best armored trucks on the server. Like, specialization in an economy. So we're like, yeah, that could be a thing too. But there's other things where the answer was murkier, and also we started considering other things. Like, we know this thing is both murkier and very expensive to make, like boss fights basically. Yeah. And so that started to stratify this list. So it made it a little bit easier to navigate, like, okay, like the top third, we'll focus there for the next month. Like, and so that's why that process for us, I'm not saying everyone should do it exactly like this or to this extent, but it took us 6 months just to work through this list of 80 things. And we were just 95% in conversations.
Yeah, and that bubbled up what we called existential questions, which is like, do these features make sense in the game? Are we going to be able to define what this could be or what the opportunity is within the game? And that helps with prioritizing what you should do during prototype, because you're always working with opportunity costs and what you spend time on during prototype, and you need to always be working on the thing that's going to help you give the most answers that then enables you to scale the team, move further towards pre-production and production eventually. So having a list like that, understanding how important each of them were relative to one another, and then assessing our confidence in the ability to execute on each of those things gave us an eventual stacked rank list of, well, what makes sense to focus on first and try to resolve and clear the ambiguity around this feature or this opportunity we have. And we kind of think of them all as player problems or player opportunities that every feature provides. And then we can go through prototyping to figure that out. And because the power of engines today, you don't need a lot of people to prototype basically anything and
Just
answer
look at
any
Valheim,
question.
literally made by 5 people. So
Yeah, and so really, even with 5 people, we were able to answer a bunch of those questions up front, and gain that clarity and clear the fog of war as we better understand the feature set and where we're confident and where we're not.
There's another side effect, if I may, of this whole exercise, which I didn't fully anticipate, which was when we first started off with our hopes and dreams and all exciting, you're joining a new startup and you're kind of like caught up in the honeymoon of that. One thing that is nefariously invisible is we're all picturing different things. You could use the same word of sandbox game or competitive game, whatever, and we're like picturing typically whatever game we came through and whatever we're referencing. And through this whole exercise, we started picturing something more and more similar. So essentially an aligning process as a side effect, in addition to the prioritization. And think about how many future fights, that helps to mitigate or prevent. And so we paid this huge upfront tax that for us, we feel a lot of conviction that it was very worth it at the cost of apparent progress. So you can imagine how we had to spend our Valorant points to keep people like, oh, like, can we see the build and can we see the picture? And we know how to do a dog and pony show. I can just farm out some pretty images and build some assets, and investors are like, oh, you guys are making so much progress. That's a real thing, and many of you will have to do this, and there's a balance to strike, but a lot of it we know is false progress. Like, today, a lot of progress is commodity, but what is invisible is design decision progress and alignment progress, which will totally bite you. If you don't invest in that later, you'll be in situations where there's disagreements that are unresolvable, and or very difficult. I don't want to say unresolvable. Difficult to resolve because they are subjective calls. Like, how much more of this feature do we make? When do we stop? This feature over this feature, and it's not like 100-0. It's like 35-65. It's like super soft. And so this is our way of preemptively mitigating those things. And again, we find it really worth it.
And he had mentioned one question. How do you split your duties, I guess? Like, did you decide that pretty early up front? And
okay.
I mean, I'd say that was like the first thing we had to figure out for the company. But I guess the way we've simply put it is, I go really deep on problems, and Slim goes very wide. So he's thinking always at the highest level of, where the product might go next, what ultimately we're looking to build for the company. I'd say like that very high level vision, and then I'm thinking of, well, how do we make that happen in the game or the experience we're creating, and what do we have to build? What's the team have to create to make that happen, to bring this opportunity that certain players might have out in the market? And that's worked pretty well for us. He'll go out and explore a bunch of areas and come back to me like, what do you think about this thing? I'm like, it seems kind of not so great, or like, actually that's really exciting. And we try to keep our tabs on all the new technologies. For a while is Web3 and blockchain tech, and now it's generative AI, and like, we don't want to be like dinosaurs and miss out on potential opportunities to build better games, but we have to balance that with the focus of the gargantuan task of just making a fun game in the first place. And I think Slim's always making sure that we're kind of coming up for air and understanding what's around us and what opportunities exist.
There's a lot of cognitive load for all of us. We're all busy. We're all tired at the end of the day from making so many decisions in a day. So we have to be very judicious and careful about what you entertain. And again, I think there's a balance to strike here where you don't make assumptions. You don't hold onto assumptions from like 10 years ago. There's like a too far, and many of our peers we call dinosaurs, we are constantly afraid of being dinosaurs ourselves. That's like mostly me yelling at myself, basically, not picking anyone else. But also just like constantly flippantly like being whiplashed around is also not productive. Both can be destructive to making progress towards your thesis.
Can I ask you a question around maybe going back to team? Maybe this is probably not as popular a topic. Like, I assume you fired people before, right? Like, how do you guys measure sort of team performance, and especially, you know, maybe obviously Riot's different. A lot of people now, very small team, but maybe there's commonalities in how you think about that philosophy and how you actually do that.
I would say you should have a sense and articulation of what you value on your team. Almost everyone only goes so far as to put raw discipline capability on that list. So typically someone will get fired for not being a good enough engineer, or an art style that's not applicable, or something like that, because it's a little bit more objective and tangible. But really, think back on all the people you've worked with and all the people you wish you could have fired if you had the position or the influence to do so. And it's almost always something else, like a lack of alignment, lack of soft skills, a lack of empathy, or something like that. So those things might be more important than capability. And everyone has their different weightings of that value. Of course, capability matters also. But we explicitly call out judgment, empathy, and a few other things.
Emotional intelligence.
Yeah. That's in our empathy thing, but
yeah,
like,
and then ownership.
Yeah, ownership, which is like basically the drive and a push and a self motivation there, and so we call that out as qualities that we want to see in candidates. So I think that's the same set of things that we would use to part ways with someone, and it doesn't mean that someone's like necessarily a bad artist or a bad at their craft or anything like that. It's just like, you want to do X, we want to do Y, you should go do X. We're gonna keep doing Y, and then that's fine. That's like all day, every day, and we'll like all help people to get to another job. Like there's no like, but I think if you come to a head where you're like already like at each other's throats, like it's like you should have done something about it way long time ago. But usually it's like some kind of like a misalignment or something like that, way before that.
We could keep going for a super, super long time. I have a question about your personal. I've always been blown away by how much you play games and how.
I think that's a
obviously
compliment.
I kind of not cringe, but like I was like, do I play enough? Like I actually don't think I do.
Oh, okay,
actually.
but maybe it's less now. I guess, how do you all balance? Like what kind of routines or schedule, or how do you think about balance as you start a new company, as it pertains to work, playing games, even like personal, family, just all the different things? How do you balance those things?
Again, I guess it's what you value and what you need, both as a company and as a person.
Yeah.
Our aspiration is to make a game that is a long-running game service, and our very far aspiration is to have a game that we can work on forever. And we're very specific about that. That's like not a generic desire for us. Like Trevor and I check in on this kind of every few months. Like if this game works out and we're 10 years in, we're 20 years in, like do we want to be a multi-game studio? Do we want to have, like, what other things do we want to accomplish here? And our more frequent conversation is, if this thing works out, we would rather expand this thing. And I look at like Hilmar as kind of like aspirationally.
At CCP, yeah.
At CCP. He is so sharp and knows his product inside and out, like 20 years in, and I'm like, dude, I'd love to be like that. I'm like, so that's what kind of like my kind of like North Star-ish. So according to that then, we're describing a very long interaction and arc. So it's more than a marathon. It's actually a limitless like marathon. So we need pacing as an example of that. So we have to be very selective on when we push as individuals and as a team. And so that is one major consideration. It's just by default, like rate base is I would say, dense per hour, but we don't pull a lot of hours. Like we do like 9 hours, because it's not useful to us to do these like artificial pushes, and then like by the time people get there, like their judgment is all degraded and they're all tilted. Like it doesn't help with what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
If we were making a game where we're like pushing for like this, gold disc by September for the holiday season for like a box game, maybe it's not a coincidence that so many teams are oriented around push hell or high water for that mark, and then half the team leaves after, and then it's fine. Like perfect then, because now we have a smaller team to prototype the next thing. It's like this cycle. It's been like for 20 years, but that's not what we're trying to do. So I like to think we're purposeful, and like we're not just generically trying to to have like a generic work-life balance. Of course, that's also important, but for us, it's very purposeful. I don't know if I'm the right guy to ask about a daily balance, because I try to play about 4 to 8 hours a night, and I'm self-conscious that it's not enough. And when I say play too, I'm paraphrasing a bit.
Yeah, sure.
Playing for me is literally playing, but it's also interviewing players. I'm hanging out on Discord every day. I'm taking notes. I'm parsing YouTube videos. All of that, I'm bucking it into that.
Yeah.
I study it, basically. I'm studying, basically. And that studying is like a long time habit as like trying, I was a terrible student, but I'm pretty good at studying games. And so like because I love it. And so all of that is in an effort to constantly hone my judgment, which by default is a constantly degrading thing. So I'm really hard on my peers that allow themselves to lapse on judgment when they're in a position to take everyone else along the ride with them along a bad train of judgment. And I really want anyone in a leadership position, which is any founder here, if you take nothing else away from this, please take that responsibility very seriously. And if you are not in a position to make that judgment call, please hand it to someone else who is or can. I'll get on my soapbox now.
Yeah, I guess this might be, we ask this question for all of our podcasts, which is kind of if you could go back and give yourself one piece of advice. It could be Riot, could be Raid-based a few years ago. Maybe you just answered that question, so maybe throwing it over to Trevor, what's kind of one piece of advice that you would give founders if you could kind of go back?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of covered it as we talked about it, but I think it's always being very thoughtful, upfront, and intentional about what you're trying to do. Take a step back and look at the high level of why you're doing the thing you're doing, and making sure you end up going down this spiral or ending up in this circular pattern where you're not actually learning every day. Like I think you want to incrementally learn. It's okay to fail as long as you're learning and taking the steps forward. So being able to remind yourself and step up and take a breath of fresh air and understand where you're at, why you're there, who you're building the game for, I think is really critical, because it's very easy to blink and all of a sudden 3 months later and you haven't made any progress, and that's because you got obsessed over like some small detail that actually doesn't matter in the long run. I've seen that many times as a reason, and we experienced it multiple times on Valorant as well, where you're just not being very effective with your time, and it's easy to get lost or get in debates or arguments over some small detail, but ultimately it's some high-level misalignment and misunderstanding that. So I think that's always a critical thing you need to be keeping track of at all times.
Awesome. Well, since we're doing a live show, now is the Q&A portion for the audience. We got a roaming mic around, so don't be shy, guys.
Thank you guys for my pandemic playing Valorant.
Oh, awesome.
I never played a tactical shooter before, but became friends with these guys in Canada who I still don't even know their real names. And I spent the first day playing Valorant. I was like, oh my God, this looks so cool. All the streamers were talking about it. I couldn't kill anyone. And then I killed somebody because I camped, and the sound went off. And I'm curious, like, when did the sound of killing combatants and agents develop, and how are you thinking about sound? Because I think that's the thing that hooked me.
Yeah, I mean, we always took the idea of recognizing and responding to when you pull something awesome off. So like the most satisfying moment we try to create is when you headshot someone. It's like everything went right. Your cursor was in the right position. You were not moving. The player walked right into where you were at, and you got the headshot and you won the fight. So we wanted to make sure that is communicated back to you immediately and that you had that impact. And what we also did is as you got multiple kills during the round, the sound would escalate. And the importance there is even if you're not paying attention to like the scoreboard, you can kind of subconsciously track how many kills you've gotten, and then you can subtract that from the remainder of players in the round and then use that as information. So we try to provide some gameplay information while also providing the impact and satisfaction of getting that kill, because I think that's probably what a lot of people play for, is that desire to like hit all the headshots and reliably be able to do that. So even thinking through animation and the way that the body responds immediately to the hit and the location of it, like so much of shooters is that visceral response in actions, and I think that's a big part of being in first person and the immersion of it. We took that whole sequence very seriously and made it all sync up on the same frames and timed it all, and you get those visual badges that pop up, all towards that effort.
Another thing I'll mention is, as you know, in any competitive game, Valorant being one of them, just like it's a very high stress environment, and in a high stress environment, people go blind to different things, and we have many tools as developers to tell them things, and if you from UI to VFX to the animation to the audio. And it's almost like there's like a parallel track to process audio, where like you might say, oh, like we put it up on the UI and we highlighted them in red, and like someone's like, you did, and they didn't even notice. And audio is a thing you can lean on to ding like the right thing to do. I mean, like this goes all the way back to like we were talking about last night with like Nintendo. I think started off as a slot machine maker
slot
or something like that.
Yeah.
And so maybe it's not an accident that like you're collecting like coins in Mario and like gems in Zelda. It's like it's a ding ding. It's like we're just at some. It's a parallel track basically. It's not that it's more effective or less effective. It's like another tool in your feedback to the player.
So thanks, guys, for really thoughtful comments. I wish I was an investor in your company. I was just really curious to go back to the taxonomy of player motivations that you talked about, like the 8 or 9 motivations. I was wondering if you could just briefly go into like what those were and how you arrived at them.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just give you a couple examples. So, and I think, I can't remember who asked, but there's also the concept of like, how do you even get to these motivations? And Slim mentioned they're classic, but I think it's a combination of what we intuitively developed over all the years of playing games, multiple decades of seeing other people play, why they play, developing that understanding with friends and acquaintances. And then also there's a lot of data. There's a lot of companies that spend a lot of time asking players and sourcing what their motivations are, why they play games. I think everybody interprets it differently and has their own perspective on it. But for example, one of the motivations that we've used in Valorant and is one of them for raid base is this idea of competition, right? So you're driven by being competitive, and people get this in sports. There's lots of in businesses, competing between businesses. So the idea that you put time and effort in, and that time and effort is rewarded by your ability to beat somebody else, or dominate them, or show how much more skillful you are, is the super satisfying loop. And to be able to play the game and put hours in and get better and see that in the game when you play, it is going to continue to motivate them as long as that loop continues. And one of the challenges competitive games run into is, well, when you plateau in skill and you're not feeling yourself getting any better, well, that's like a huge churn moment, because it's like I've lost the motivation of why I play this game. And then another example is like exploring, finding information, being like a scout, or getting knowledge and information that other players don't have, and just genuinely wanting to go around, explore the world, and within the world finding things that is valuable, is appreciable. For us, when we think about that specific motivation and tying it back to our thesis, like someone mentioned with reputation, it's like, well, what can I do exploring this world and finding things that's going to build a reputation for me? Like, do I know knowledge about where a boss is that nobody else has? Or do I know how to craft this item that no one else on the server understands how to create? now someone might recognize me or value me for that information that I have. So we always tie things back to the thesis. And for us, the motivation set we choose to support is basically the scope of our game, because we have to have a feature set and they have to work together in a way where anybody in that motivation set is going to be satisfied when they play.
In that latter profile, you get familiar with Game of Thrones? You're familiar with John Wick? Okay, so in each of these, there's an example of this. So Varys in Game of Thrones, as far as I don't remember, like never had to pick up a weapon and fight. But was he one of the most influential people in the whole universe? Yes, because he had info that everyone else needed and wanted. Same thing in John Wick, where there's I think they literally, I hope this is not like a bad term, but I think they literally call it the Hobo Clan. Basically the homeless people in there, and they were like the Whisper Network, they were like the eyes and ears on the ground, and you would think like it's not aspirational on that description alone, but they rendered it like really powerful, they're really influential, they were the secret network like throughout, and so those inspired us to like, oh, those are like very practical recent examples of this, but this motivation we've seen for 20 years of playing games. Like someone's a scout, they're like exploring out there and coming back home with like, okay, there's a titanium just spawned on the mountain, like we should go lock this down before anyone else gets out to us. So I mean, you literally see this in real life economies, like people go out and scout things before other people, and yeah. I mean, like all investors aren't investor scouts, right? So you got this is you guys. This is right. This is like
I've always aspired to own a lot of pigeons. That's what I really want.
Like, you need to explore where other investors aren't. Maybe you do need a pigeon network.
It's also a really good alignment tool to be able to tell a story in your game about this profile and say, oh, what's an example of their experience in the game, and let's walk through a journey of what they do that they'd be able to tell a story about and would be memorable. And then the team's able to kind of imagine and understand how that might manifest. Why are all these features important and critical to making that happen?
Other questions?
Hey, I'm Pimo at Scopely and Product, and I wonder if I could invite you guys to talk a little bit about creators and community and how you've been thinking about that, whether Raid-Base or Valorant in the past. By the way, I played Valorant for the first time 2 weeks ago at a K-Town PC cafe under sheer force of my younger brother.
Awesome.
It was incredibly anxiety-inducing, and I think it killed all of my self-esteem, so thank you.
Don't worry,
Sounds about right.
That's where it starts, so that you have all this climb ahead of you, this glorious future ahead. It's like that's what it's all about. You can feel that contrast, right? Okay, so we have barely thought about this, but we've been paying attention as much as we can. The landscape of influencers and even what's included as an influencer seems to be changing all the time. We've seen a lot of counterproductive behaviors where we were just talking to an influencer today about this, where does it still work to pay an influencer to play your game? I think there are many examples where you see a game pop off on Twitch for the few hours that everyone's getting paid to do it, and by the end of the night, let alone by tomorrow, no one can recall like, what was that game again? No one cares basically about it. And I think now players and viewers can smell when their favorite influencers are forced to or paid to play the game, and that can even not only be not helpful, but maybe even counterproductive toward that end. And so what does that mean for influencers now? Like, is the whole rev stream denied to them? Like, I think that's a whole conversation of exploration with them. So how do we integrate with them as our strategy for promoting our game, if any at all? And so these are we're far from shipping a beta, so these are all questions the kinds of questions we ask ourselves along the way. And we're very we like to think we're open-minded and very flexible to any kind of combination of this. We feel like there's definitely something there that influencers can point their audiences to. But there's also a lot of nuance to this. Like, do people follow that influencer because of that personality? Do they care at all about what what product they're using? And there's varying levels of that being yes or no, or applicable to our game. So like, if you're trying to, let's say we don't know what our business model is yet. If we sell our game for an amount of money, a premium game, there are some people who in that situation or that business model would love to pump their game, because a pump leads to a sale, and then you got your money. You accomplish your goal. But given what we described earlier, where we hope our game is a long service, whether or not we charge for it at any given point, we think we rely on an audience that sticks around. So a pump can be even counterproductive, because if it pumps and our game isn't ready and they don't stay, everyone will watch it drop. And so instantly with our audience, it's like quite jaded. They'll be like, oh, dead game. And it's like, it can be actually quite counterproductive for us. So these are all just musings and observations that we don't know quite fully what to do with yet, but we are trying our best to pay attention.
One last question, I think, is what they're
Justin?
saying, right? One more? Okay, we got one more question.
Because this is on behalf of some of the investors in the room, and probably also relevant to founders who are thinking about starting new studios. How did you guys think about kind of getting the initial financing in place and the right partners to work with, ideating with, working with a VC, strategic, and obviously at different stages, there's different types of value. So could you talk a little bit about how you guys thought about that?
Yeah. So our path was very unusual, I think, in a few ways. We, hopefully for the better, hopefully not for the worse, consistently optimized towards long relationships of trust and alignment. And as you can hopefully tell, like, we're trying to be consistent about this everywhere, from our product to our team, the recruiting. We're trying to reduce friction in general, because the business of the choices that we're trying to make to design a game is way hard enough already. So we do this at the cost of, we have done this consistently at the cost of valuation and other things that you're supposed to optimize for as founders. It's not that we are trying to fly in the face of that. It is, those traditional things from valuation and dilution, all that, and amount raised, of course, are critical and important. They're on deck to consider. We just prioritize trust and alignment more whenever we can muster the choice to do so. And thankfully, we've had that choice so far, and we can demonstrate that we paid for it. In our seed round, we ended up deliberately taking a set of investors that at half the valuation of most of the offers that we got. And that has side effects and other costs, like not the least of which, as a pragmatic matter, at our Series A, we had this monster pro rata that I had to manage. And then you have all these people who want to put in and support you, and you're like, you have to say, hey, I need you to come in like way lower here for the pro rata. And it's like, these are small things that I didn't know it was gonna be a side effect. And who in the world would pick a lower valuation? Like, this guy is an idiot. But for whatever it's worth, we have not regretted that decision in the slightest. It worked out so far. Again, we're only 2-3 years in, so maybe we're not fully tested yet. But so far, it has paid off the way we hoped, where our investors are the most, the least maintenance, the most drop everything at a drop of a hat to support us. When SVB happened, we had every single one of our investors offered to cover payroll without me even having to ask. They hit me up. They're like, hey, are you guys okay? Can we pay your next payroll? Are you guys okay on that? And so I don't know, how much is that worth? Like, in one way I try to rationalize it to myself is we pay twice as much for something priceless, basically. I don't know, hopefully that stays true. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, let's give these guys a round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you all for coming. Obviously, drinks, bar, and everything's open. And excited
Food
to
over here?
Food is over there.
Thanks
Yes,
everyone
there is
for
food.
great
Thank you.
questions. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.